Chapter 20. Chapter XX Advanced Level. The golden door creaked open before the 7-member group.
I don't wanna go.
Meeks whimpered and clutched Masage's arm. Inside were 5 doors at the back of an enormous room. The middle door was open. The soft rustling of robes was the only sound to be heard.
It's them.
Meeks whispered loudly and pulled Masage's sleeve roughly back. The mage frowned and pushed Meeks ahead.
They're probably only clerics,
he offered in an attempt to make the warrior feel better, although he knew that no clerics were actually in the room ahead. Alexia's tone had darkened somewhat from its original optimistic state.
Perhaps we should be protected before we go. Sounds fair.
She looked at the crew's mages.
How about some paralysis protection spells?
She asked, none too timidly. Prisma, Sanral, and Massage gathered around the crew morosely. They began to chant and raised their hands out to their sides to encircle the group with their web of magic. The mages found it difficult to concentrate knowing that Illithids awaited them in the 5 chambers ahead, and besides, they felt as though their minds were being tapped. The spell completed, the entire group was protected from any paralyzing attacks, which was important, seeing as the Illithids' first offensive move was to paralyze their opponents.
What if we make ourselves invisible?
Will asked from beside Prisma, desperate to get as much advantage over the mind flayers as possible. Prisma nudged he cleric and shook her head.
Nope. They're too smart. Isn't that obvious by now, Will?
She asked rather irritably. The cleric rolled his eyes and then looked away. Meek's loud voice sounded again, only to add to the party's nervousness.
They're listening,
she cried, her face panic-stricken and her dark eyes locked on the inside of the room ahead.
They're here,
Dran declared disdainfully and turned to face Sindel.
They're with Rain and the Illithids. If they don't finish them off, then we'll have to fight. I am not sending any of my clerics into battle.
His eyes showed concern and a tinge of fear. Sindel paced the length of Dran's personal chambers.
You're just one man and I'm just one woman. How are we supposed to go against them after they leveled the rest of the temple?
She asked with a deep frown on her face. She looked over at Dran and noted a twinkle in the man's emerald eyes.
Right, it's just one man and one woman.
The cleric trailed off, seemingly thinking about something else altogether. Sindel walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders.
You really don't want Kelvin to win this one, do you?
She asked and Dran glared at her.
I'm just as dumbfounded as you about how my ex-party could have made it this far, but I beg of you not to lose hope. There's got to be a secret weapon we haven't dished out.
Right. The High Priestess piped, holding Dran's gaze firmly. The High Priest of Temple Darkmoon smirked suddenly.
But of course, my dear, there's always a secret weapon.
When the team finally decided to enter the firelit room, the 4 doors at the back that were closed opened up and Illithids piled out. The Illithids did not bother casting paralysis spells. They had indeed been listening. Each party member darted for one of the doors and began fighting the mind flayers like reckless fools. Izzy had to be found. Meeks, who had run off into the battle on her own, bolted towards the middle of the 5 doors, the open one, and started to enter the room beyond. The slow-witted fighter gasped as a tall, golden-robed Illithid stepped in her way.
Rain!
Meeks shouted at the creature, her knees growing weak. The Illithid wiggled his fingers in delight.
So we meet again.
The creature's voice entered Meek's mind. Prisma and Nightshade were cast away from the doorway they had picked to ambush by 6 angry Illithids.
Help us, Loth!
Prisma called to her goddess as she drew her blade and readied herself for the attack she knew was coming. Nightshade's jaw dropped. She summoned her magic, which she had only used once before during the whole adventure. The thief cast a lightning bolt spell that zapped past Prisma's arm and hit head-on the group of 6 Illithids.
Yes!
She cried as 2 of the creatures, not quick enough to move, crumbled to the ground a few feet away. Prisma had already driven herself amongst the Illithids and was thrashing madly with her sword. The creatures were unarmed. All the way across the room, Massage and Wool squared off against another group of 6 mind flayers. Unlike the others that Prisma and Nightshade were fighting, these Illithids made the first move. They simultaneously launched psychic blasts at their 2 assailants. Massage and Wool screamed in pain. The blast was enormous and horribly painful. It felt like claws were trying to tear their minds apart. When would the shock subside? Having a more plausible chance of winning, Sanral and Elixia met with a smaller group of armed mind flayers. The creatures did not cry out when they charged ahead, whirling their slender sabers dexterously.
Run!
Elixia screamed and grabbed Sanral's sweaty hand, pulling him with her as she tore past the charging mind flayers and into the room beyond. She had about 2 seconds before the Illithids turned and met up with her, but she had the chance to look around the room. Izzy was there. The little thief sat on a chair and her head drooped onto her chest. The rescue mission had worked. Well. Sorta, she corrected herself as she turned along with Sanral and faced the angry group of Illithids. One of the creatures wrapped its arms around Prisma and held her in a bear hug, not an affectionate one, but a fatal one.
Prisma!
Nightshade cried and burned to help her friend, but found herself unable to do so with 3 illithids circling her. The creature's grasp was amazingly strong, the drow-ass could hardly breathe.
I knew this was a trap.
Nightshade cried out to whomever cared to hear. Rain drew out a gleaming saber and held it out horizontally before Meeks. The warrior raised her halberd.
Call them all off. We are here to stop a great wrong.
She dared to yell, not realizing that Rain could hear her think. A tremendous energy wave coming from Rain swept over Meeks, but, even though her brain was racked with agony, she gritted her teeth and swung her pole arm, and missed. Rain's watery voice talked to her once more.
What wrong do you speak of? This is a temple, Meeks.
It stated matter-of-factly. Meeks didn't care for chit-chat. She jumped the mind flayer and threw him to the ground. The two thrashed and wriggled away from one another, always keeping a sword's length between them. When the pain left, Will and Massage were weak as kittens. Their 6 opponents prepared for another blast. Without even thinking it through, the two turned tail and ran from the room, all the way back into the hallway outside, and further still.
Izzy!
Elixia called, but the thief did not answer. Ignoring the chasing illithids, Elixia and Sanral ran to the chair where the girl sat.
It's too late.
Sanral breathed, tipping Izzy's lifeless arm. He felt sick to his stomach. Elixia screeched in frustration and realized that this whole rescue mission had been a trap orchestrated by the illithids.
No.
She protested and sneered. Bright flames erupted from Sanral's fingertips and spiraled out at the armed mind flayers. One was harmed and the others nimbly darted away.
This is hopeless.
Sanral yelled at Elixia's side, preparing for another spell.
There's too many and they're too strong.
His words sounded dark and apocalyptic to his beloved teammate. Past Rain, Meeks could see Elixia and Sanral as well as more mind flayers. She also saw a person in a chair. The person was Izzy, and she was dead.
Meeks!
A feminine voice shrieked and she recognized it as Elixia's. She looked up from her wrestling match with Rain and her friend was running towards her with Sanral close behind.
Turn and run!
The redhead pleaded. Meeks didn't care to argue. The last thing she wanted to do was remain in that room with all those brains on legs. She punched Rain in the side and pulled herself to her feet with the help of her weapon. Elixia and Sanral ran past Meeks, jumping over the fallen Rain.
Wait for me!
Meeks called and bolted along at their heels. Nightshade's eyes bulged as she saw her teammates run the opposite direction. She began to panic and understood why they had fled. She looked over at her half-dying friend and, with a rush of adrenaline, charged forward through the mind flayers that circled her and sliced open the arm of the one who hugged Prisma. It shrieked silently and Prisma crumbled into Nightshade's arms.
We're leaving.
She said to no one in particular then, forcing Prisma to shape up, turned and fled from the room along with her slightly slower partner. Will and Massage, frightened out of their minds, had bolted into the hallway and had run down in the opposite direction as the team had initially come. They felt weak, their magic felt as though it had been lost, and their heads ached with the residual psychic blast. They ran until they reached a new staircase. One somewhat shorter than they had encountered before. They stopped before it and caught their breath, casting nervous looks over their shoulders.
Damn!
Massage cursed and clutched at his head.
We ran right into a trap.
He let the absurdity of the statement speak for itself. Beside him, sucking in deep breaths, was Will.
Everyone's still back there. We just deserted our team.
He said, coming to terms with reality. Indeed they had, and now they felt awful for it. They didn't even know where they were anymore. Massage frowned concernedly and looked around the room. It was huge and empty.
So? Where the hell are we?
He asked grimly, genuinely happy to be away from the illithids. Will shook his head and opened his mouth to answer the wizard, but another voice cut him off.
You are trespassing on my property.
Dran Dragor said, his voice calm and controlled, even though his heart told him to grab the two fools and kill them on the spot. Will and Massage whipped around to face the staircase, where Sindel and Dran stood quaintly.
You!
Will gasped and drew his longsword but did not advance on the high priest.
You bastard!
He spat at the taller man. Massage froze when he met Sindel's gaze. Anger swelled up within him like an oil pit. Sindel was a traitor. And a wench. Dran's expression hardened.
I don't appreciate being insulted in my own home.
He said seriously, glaring at Will with an air of contempt.
Where's the rest of you band of mercenaries? I'm sure there was more than just you and the mage.
He asked with a raised eyebrow. Will regained his composure, but wavered when he stood straight.
They are not of your concern right now, Dragor. You have brought hell to my crew and you dare to put doubts in the minds of my friends concerning your role in this whole affair.
He stated, his voice just as dead serious as Dran's had been a moment ago. Dran was not impressed.
Then maybe your friends are smarter than you, William.
He retorted with an evil sneer.
Do you even realize what pain you've caused me? What damage you've brought to my temple? Or even what harm you've brought to my minions?
He asked, advancing on Will. The team's cleric drew his sword up and held it between him and Dran.
You are a fiend. You have killed innocent people. The Waterdeep loses sleep thinking of the atrocities that go on in this hole you call your temple.
Will dared to argue, finding it difficult to hold the high priest's icy gaze without flinching. Near them, Sindel and Massage continued to stare at one another like statues. In a flash, Dran pulled a sword from beneath his flaming red overcoat.
What have I told you about insulting me here?
He cried, slapping Will's sword to the side and sending it flying across the room. He held the blade to Will's neck in his fury.
Who are you to decide who is the villain and who is the culprit in this affair? You obey the man who paid you and keep your mind shut out from all other ideas, including the one that says you might have made a mistake.
He hissed at Will and narrowed his eyes.
You fight for the good of the people, but do you really know which side is which? Your behavior in the last week has not helped me to think you do.
He was so angry at the other cleric, and his team, that he didn't even notice Sindel and Massage lunging for each other. The mage and the high priestess hit the floor in a heap and tried desperately to hurt one another. Massage grabbed handfuls of Sindel's golden hair and pulled.
I hate you.
He yelped childishly, the whole thing resembling a kid fight. Sindel flailed with her fists and succeeded in landing a few punches.
You're an arrogant fool. And a mooch.
She fought on and scratched deep lines across Massage's neck. The mage howled and grabbed Sindel's arms, then began slamming the woman's back against the carpeted floor. Sindel continued to claw and flail with her fists. They would have went on until one of the two had died, but they were stopped before things got worse.
Stop this now!
Dran hollered and tore Massage off of Sindel with his free hand. The slender drow gritted his teeth and tried to jump back at Sindel, but a sword point touched his nose.
All right then.
Massage gulped, meeting Dran's infuriated gaze. The man did not look human when he was angry, Massage concluded. Will did not come to Massage's aid as Dran helped Sindel to her feet. He seemed to be thinking something over, something important. Sindel gave Massage a cold look and mouthed a particularly insulting set of words to him. The mage tore out of Will's grip and jumped Sindel a second time. Unfortunately, this time, Dran was close to Sindel. The high priest launched a punch at the wizard that knocked the drow cold out. Massage dropped to the floor, unconscious. Dran looked down at Massage's unmoving form and congratulated himself. From what he had just seen, Sindel had been right about the mage's bad attitude. He shot a glare at Will and, all of his earlier anger returning, handed his sword to Sindel.
Here,
he said evenly.
Do what you've always wanted to do with the cleric.
Sindel grasped the sword and backhanded the blade across Will's stomach. The cleric didn't even try to fight, he just collapsed. Dran took the bloodied sword back from Sindel's trembling hand. The woman looked up at him inquisitively.
He didn't even fight me.
She breathed, turning her head to stare triumphantly down at Will's body. Dran sheathed the weapon, his emerald eyes aglimmer.
My words finally got through to his mind. He must have realized his mistake.
He answered quietly.
How sad that it had to take this long.
He added without conviction. He turned and climbed the stairs to his personal chambers, Sindel close behind as always.
The others are coming.
He declared simply. Rain and the Illithids did not follow the team when they left the room. The crew ran in the only direction that they could, the opposite in which they came. They stopped when they reached a large room where two bodies lay on the ground. Their pace slowed and their stomachs tightened.
Will and Massage.
Prisma cried, recognizing the two motionless figures. She darted into the room and the rest of the crew followed close behind. They ran up to the two bodies and Meeks began to panic.
Not again.
She whined as her eyes set upon Massage. She was reminded of the time in the test where the mage had been poisoned. She hoped nothing serious had happened this time. She knelt down by his side and she immediately felt his breathing. She hugged him right there, but he did not come to, even after being shaken a few times.
He won't wake up.
Meeks sniffed at the rest of her team that had gathered by Will's body.
Neither will Will.
Alexia's dismal tone rang out, clear as a high-pitched bell. She had placed her hands on the cleric's large wound and her hands were now covered in warm blood. Meeks looked over to her side and inspected Will's corpse.
He's dead.
She cried in shock, wondering how this had happened and coming to the conclusion that at least she hadn't done it.
What are we gonna do?
Nightshade asked, panic-stricken to the extreme.
What happened?
She asked furthermore. The team looked over at Massage and reveled in the fact that the little mage was still alive, unconscious, but still alive.
I don't know what happened, I really don't.
Sanral said, his voice meager and reserved, like it was when the group had first found him in the catacombs dungeons. He looked up at the staircase to his side and his features hardened.
I think we've come to the end of our mission, people.
Elixia declared and got up from the two unmoving forms of her fallen teammates. She looked up at the staircase and frowned.
This is it, boys and girls.
She breathed determinedly and unsheathed her scimitar. The crew joined at her sides and followed her gaze. Dran and Sindel stood gravely at the top of the stairs. End of chapter. Chapter 21. Chapter XXI Endgame.
So it has come to this.
Dran said darkly as he and Sindel descended the stairs towards the waiting group of dumbfounded warriors. Sindel gripped the cleric's arm in sudden nervousness. She felt edgy seeing her crew again. Especially when they all glared at her like we're doing then.
You all realize that if you destroy me, Darkmoon is not necessarily going to be yours.
Dran went on, eyeing the party dismally, becoming aware of the clash that would surely follow.
But we'll have rid the Waterdeep of a massive nuisance.
Elixia called defiantly at the approaching clerics, startling her teammates in their silent disbelief. At her side, Meeks was preparing the blade of her weapon, but even she didn't notice how she slowly backed away from her oncoming enemies. Dran and Sindel reached the bottom of the stairs.
I still don't understand why it is that you cannot see the mistake you are making.
The high priest said annoyedly, crossing his arms over his chest and glaring at the crew before him.
If you kill me and take down my temple, you will be letting the bad guys win, and wouldn't that be defeating the purpose of your mission? Would you be proud to know that you've all been a party to the greatest, unjust mass murder the Waterdeep has ever seen? Sure, you would all be Kelvin Blackstaff's favorites, but only because of your ignorance.
He fumed. The group stared for a moment and processed the information. Then, Meeks, having processed nothing at all, spoke up.
You're just playing mind games with us.
She cried. The group stirred behind her. Beside Dran, Sindel's features hardened.
Meeks, will you quit being your thick-skulled self and open up your mind for a moment? Dran speaks the truth, and I'm not just saying that because I've been brainwashed for the past few days. Kelvin is not what you all think he is. I've known that from the beginning. It was his station as Archmage that justified his decision to send us all out after Darkmoon. We've been Kelvin's pawns since the beginning. This is all a setup.
She finished dramatically, in one last attempt at making her ex-team see the light. The members of the raiding party were absolutely lost in this whole affair. Since the beginning of the mission, too many doubts had sunk in and now a huge decision had to be taken. Too huge. Too final. There was a symbolic staring fight between Dran, Sindel, and the group. Prisma, from the back, looked down at her side where Will's inert body lay.
Will's dead?
The Drowess declared, somewhat disturbed by the thought. She looked up at Dran and Sindel and shook her head.
Why did you kill Will?
She asked simply. Dran opened his mouth to respond but Sindel's sharp tongue lashed first.
Because he deserved it. He was an impediment. He would have driven you all into the depths of ignorance with his cursed faith in Kelvin.
She answered the sorceress, looking disdainfully down at the cleric's body. It was clear to the group that she had killed Will.
He was still one of our friends.
Sanral snapped back at the high priestess.
You had no right.
He added, narrowing his eyes. This was going nowhere. Everyone in the room then decided. The opinions on what to do next were too varied. Dran and Sindel watched the group intently, reading their expressions and trying to figure what would be the final outcome of the meeting. They were saddened and rather angry to find that the group would not understand their fault no matter how much breath was wasted on explanation, and in that case, there was only one thing to do.
Goodbye then.
Dran said with a sneer and launched a fireball at the party. The spell was unexpected and the group was caught off guard. They bolted to the sides and suffered only minor singes. Dran had crossed the line and now the time to fight had come. Meeks and Elixia got up from the ground and drew their weapons, charging on Dran and Sindel. Sindel raised her hand and a set of light blue crystal erupted from her fingertips, spreading out into a sheet. The crystals made contact with the two fighters and they found themselves unable to move. It was a paralysis spell. Gawking off to the side, Sanral and Prisma became nervous and frightened. They had fought monsters and clerics before, and that meant they could fight Dran and Sindel too. Sanral jumped to his feet and executed a few quick motions with his hands. He shouted a single word and a lightning bolt sizzled towards Dran and his high priestess. Sindel jumped to the side with haste but Dran did not budge. The spell hit him but caused no damage. Sanral swore loudly and came to the conclusion that magic did not affect Dran. He tried to figure why but decided to worry about it later as Dran drew a longsword from beneath his overcoat and stalked towards him.
Foolish wizard! You're almost as bad as the other one.
Dran spat and advanced on the little drow who drew a meager dagger from the sleeve of his thick robes. Sanral felt a pang of hatred at the cleric for having mentioned massage and used the adrenaline it summoned for him. With a cry, he flicked his wrist and flung the dagger at Dran. Dran smoothly sidestepped and smiled wide. Sanral gulped.
Oh no you don't.
Nightshade mumbled to herself as she saw Sanral's predicament. She bolted towards Dran and swung for his side. Dran whipped away from Sanral and deflected Nightshade's thrust. Figuring the wizard was powerless over him and that he could wait, Dran engaged in sword play with the raven-haired thief. Nightshade soon wished she hadn't been so quick to play the hero. Dran was not all that quick, but he was unusually strong, his blows causing Nightshade's grip to falter and quake. Nightshade cut low, desperately wanting to get a hit in, but Dran caught her blade with his and raised the two swords high, making it harder for the thief to keep her strength at its largest intensity. Roughly, Dran pushed Nightshade away and then charged her. The two fought once more. Near the staircase, Prisma was facing off with Sindel.
Is this what you really want, Prisma? Do you really want to kill one of your friends?
Sindel asked the Drowess, in an attempt to discourage her ex-teammate from engaging into combat with her. Prisma laughed in her face, a shrill, cold laugh.
It would only be fair pay for what you did to mine.
She cried and pushed Sindel against the wall behind her. The High Priestess clenched her teeth and unsheathed the sword at her hip.
Have it your way.
She hissed and jumped at Prisma. Prisma cast a translocation spell on herself and appeared about 30 feet away from Sindel. She summoned magical power and launched a fireball of her own, figuring that, since Sindel had dived to the side when Sanral had cast a lightning bolt a few moments ago, she didn't have the same magical resistance as Dran. The searing ball of flames shot forth and engulfed Sindel in flames, sending the priestess back against the wall. Prisma was not ready to celebrate yet, and for good reason. A few seconds later, Sindel rolled out of the inferno, most of her hair singed and her robes tattered.
You bitch!
Sindel screeched, flames still licking the hem of her dark blue robes. She shot her hands forward and a column of fire shot down from the ceiling, injuring Prisma as much as she had been injured. Prisma tucked out of the column as the thing disappeared and faced Sindel with clenched fists.
Now it's on!
She called and the two ran at each other, one with partially flaming robes and the other with greatly shortened hair. The hall was a pandemonium. Sanral forced himself to ignore the commotion and focus on the spell he wished to summon. He stood before the two immobile warriors that had been the first to suffer the full effects of a spell.
I can still work my magic, even if it isn't on the enemy.
He mumbled to himself as he busied himself at flipping through his spell book. He found the page, licked his lips anxiously and summoned the spell, waving his hands around the still forms of Meeks and Elixia. Within moments, Sindel's paralysis spell was broken and the two fighters regained freedom of movement.
Oh my god!
Elixia gasped as she looked around the room. Dran and Nightshade were busily deflecting each other's sword blows, Prisma and Sindel, if that was indeed them. For they looked somewhat different after the consecutive fire spells, were on the ground trying to throttle one another, and Massage still lay unconscious on the red carpeted floor by the staircase.
Thank you, Sanral.
Elixia said to the smiling drow, then kissed his lips soundly.
How long have we been out? Are you okay?
She asked hastily. Meeks was eager to jump into battle at her side. Sanral frowned deeply.
I'm fine. You haven't been out for very long. I discovered something very displeasing. Dran is immune to magic,
he declared with a grunt. Meeks did not hear. Elixia's jaw dropped and then she searched out Dran and Nightshade.
Then we'll have to gang up on him,
she said bravely. Meeks was already gone.
Help!
Nightshade cried between gasps of air, fearing that she would soon be unable to hold Dran any longer. Luckily, she had suffered no wounds. Or inflicted any. Meek's husky voice was heard yelling barbarically and the blade of a polearm sliced at Dran's side from behind. Help was here. Elixia was running in to join the battle. Her hope rose as she watched Nightshade and Meeks fight against a now overmatched Dran. Sanral had run over to the unconscious Massage's side and now knelt by his companion. Massage had to be wakened. Help was needed. Feeling a little odd doing so, Sanral slapped Massage across the face twice. The other wizard did not wake. Sanral began to grumble and he roughly shook Massage, then he began to yell in his ear. Still nothing happened.
Come on!
Sanral yelled restlessly, impatiently, and slapped his friend some more. With a few more slaps, Massage finally came to. He frowned up at Sanral.
Slap me one more time and I'll kill you,
Massage warned. Sanral found himself smiling at the threat but kept nothing from Massage.
Sure you can, if I don't get killed out here first,
he said cynically, waving his arm out to show the scene going on in the large hall. Massage pulled himself to a sitting position and looked around at the room. His eyebrows shot up and his jaw dropped.
Oh no!
He whimpered meekly. Sanral stood up and pulled Massage with him.
We have to help. And don't even think of using magic on Dran, he's immune,
he said simply. From the left side of the room, Sindel and Prisma ripped and tore at each other, their swords having been thrown away and labeled as pointless. Prisma straddled Sindel and drew her fist back for a punch. Sindel wriggled away from the target and Prisma smashed her hand on the floor, howling in pain. Loud cries sounded from the center of the hall and Sindel found the time to look and see what was going on. She was horrified at what she saw. Dran was pulling away, intensely injured, from Elixia, Meeks and Nightshade. He amazingly found the strength to fight off some of the attacks that kept coming, but Sindel came to the conclusion that he would not last much longer.
Dran!
She yelled at the top of her lungs, and with a burst of fury-based strength, she tore out of Prisma's grasp and got to her feet. Prisma got up to continue her fight, but Sindel had already taken flight to the center of the room where the larger battle was happening. When Sindel got to Dran, the cleric collapsed to the ground in a bloodied heap. Sindel threw herself to the ground and wrapped her arms around Dran protectively, unable to find words to say what she needed to say. Dran leaned on Sindel and spoke, not to her, but to the crew.
Do not seal. Break yet, fools.
Dran gasped, throwing his sword at his three assailants and grinning devilishly. Something in the man's emerald eyes gleamed and warned the team to back away. They got the idea that something bad was going to happen.
Because something wicked this way comes.
Dran cursed, his normally booming voice weakened, turned for a moment to look up at Sindel. He seemed thoughtful. The High Priestess smiled a melancholy smile down at him, and Dran seemed even more thoughtful than before.
I do have a secret weapon, my dear,
he said softly, and suddenly pulled away from her grasp. Massage and Sanral, who approached the center of the room wearing wan smiles, stopped in their tracks and stared at what they thought was the death of Dran Dragor. The High Priest shape-shifted into the form of a great red dragon and rose to his feet, then spat fire at the group of warriors gathered around. The two mages screamed their hearts out and ran to the sides as the searing flame engulfed a good third of the room. A dragon. This was completely uncalled for. Sindel stood unmoving in the center of the room. She mumbled to herself as she watched the great dragon sweep the room with its gaze, waiting to see what condition its victims were in. A whole set of thoughts assailed her brain then, and a whole bunch of puzzle pieces began to click into shape. Sindel just couldn't believe her eyes. The members of the party had taken cover in the farmost corners of the hall. Meeks and Elixia stared at each other and wondered what to do next. Nightshade and Prisma trembled together in a corner. Sanral and Massage, on the other hand, rejoiced at this unexpected turn of events. Their magic would work on the dragon. They simply knew it for a fact, and this made the two mages ecstatic. To their demise though, they realized that they would not have the time to cast the more powerful spells, the ones that would have been the more obvious choices. They prepared their spells and, figuring that they could hold off the dragon until the fighters came in, started off to face the Wyrm. They had to act quick. The team watched the two suicidal-looking drow advance on the dragon and utter a few words. Successive bolts of lightning showered the red dragon and caused it to thrash in pain. The two wizards did not stop the magic. As was expected, the other party members ran to the attack, staying perilously close to the dragon even as it thrashed. Even more caution was needed when it began to spit fire at the party. Meeks and Elixia hacked at the worm's flanks and deftly avoided being smashed to the ground. Meeks suffered a few lacerations from being too close to the claws but continued to swing her blade methodically. Sindel continued to watch, helpless like she had never been, until the dragon fell to the ground and her ex-team scattered about. She screamed and ran to the fallen dragon, pushing down those in her way. Tired and weary from their fight, the party did nothing to stop her. Sindel knelt once more before Dran and decided to get answers to her questions.
Dran? You were never human, were you?
She asked softly, resting her hands on the worm's scaly neck. Barely breathing, Dran spoke.
No, I didn't mean to keep it from you, no one knows. Not even Kelvin.
He answered in the same cavernous voice as he had in his human form.
Didn't want to frighten anyone.
He added. Sindel tightened her lips and swallowed thickly. A whole bunch of questions got their answer at that moment, the temple's insignia, the lovely statuettes, the fact that Dran was always hesitant to talk about his past, and especially the High Priest's emerald eyes. She scolded herself for not having noticed earlier, it had been so obvious. A new thought came into her mind then, that of the prophecy Dran had read to her a few days ago. It had spoken of a serpent priest and Sindel had not understood. Things have finally become clear. With that out of the way, she realized that if the prophecy had spoken true, then she had been a fool to wave it away when Dran had shown it to her. She pondered the prophecy as she felt the last of Dran's life slowly slip away in his laborious breathing.
When the priest of serpents strays and finds the daughter of vice and virtue, an empire will be built. Foes to friends, bliss. Friends to foes, chaos. When all seems lost, the child who is not will come and take the blessed city's throne.
This was all too much for her. She would surely go mad.
Kelvin will reward you all greatly for your deeds, your ignorant deeds.
Dran breathed, his voice raspy now. Sindel's hands trembled as she felt Dran take his last breath, a tear rolled down her cheek and she frowned.
This can't be.
She whispered to herself.
The prophecy writes of an empire. Dran.
She choked and leaned her cheek against the worm's scaly flesh.
I feel like we've done something wrong.
Meeks whimpered suddenly, hugging her halberd to her chest. Sindul's head whipped up and the priestess shot the fighter a wicked glance.
Now you notice.
She spat vindicatively and Meeks lowered her gaze. Sindul glared at everyone in turn, letting them all know what they had done and how stupid they were to have done it.
Go back to Kelvin and claim your god-forsaken money.
Sindul cried suddenly,
but don't forget to kill me first. Oh, and you might as well crush the temple while you're at it.
She added sarcastically, tears flowing steadily down her cheeks. She held out her arms and gritted her teeth.
Go ahead.
She taunted them.
Cowards. You're all a bunch of cowards. Cowards for not having taken the initiative to stop and think about what you were doing. Cowards for having followed Will's biased train of thought. Cowards for not killing me now.
She went on passionately. The team shifted uncomfortably. When the team looked into Sindul's eyes, they saw what they should have seen a very long time ago, their mistake. End of chapter. Chapter and Chapter 22. Chapter XXII Back to Square One. Sanral and Massage advanced on Sindul, their lips silently reciting the incantations to quick-working death spells. If the priestess wanted to die, then she would. Sindul's gaze held that of the two mages with unwavering intensity. Just as the climactic words of the spells were uttered, Massage and Sanral were held back, rather unexpectedly, by Meeks and Elixia.
No.
Elixia breathed, staying Sanral's arm. The warrior woman looked over at Sindul and noted the high priestess' chiseled expression.
We've gone far enough.
She added on a determined tone. Sanral slumped in her grasp, forcing himself to come to terms with the reality of the moment. All the remaining party members lowered their gaze and spent some time in personal reflection of the past week's mind-racking adventure. It was hard for them to grasp the fact that everything they had strived over was for naught. It was even harder to grasp the fact that their indecisiveness and negligence had cost them a few party members as well as their dignity. Sindul stayed protectively close to the lifeless body of Dran Dragor.
Appearances can be deceiving, wouldn't you all agree?
She declared to her ex-team as much as to herself. Her voice was no longer as passionate as it has been a moment ago, now it was dull and dismal. The group responded with a series of deep breaths and questioning looks. Sindul returned her gaze to the red dragon and soon after, Nightshade spoke up.
We didn't know what to do, Sindul. You have to understand that.
She said softly. The priestess' head snapped up and she narrowed her eyes at the dark-haired thief.
It's not like I didn't try to warn you all.
She cried, the passion returning.
So what do we do now?
Prisma asked before Sindul could ramble on and make the team feel worse than they did at the moment. There was an uneasy silence and then Sindul offered a solution.
You will undo what you have done.
She began, finally rising to her feet.
You will redress your wrongs.
She looked down at Dran and smiled lightly, then looked over at the team.
As far as I know, the resurrection chamber by the entrance lobby still holds the power to raise the dead, at least once or twice more. Am I right?
She asked the group. Heads nodded their approval. Meeks, ever worried about the technicalities of things, expressed her concern.
How do you expect us to carry Dran down there? And we teleported here, we don't exactly know how to make it back to the resurrection chamber.
She pointed out, still feeling odd about what they were about to do. With a wave of her hand, Sindul swept aside the question.
Do not fret, I can fix everything.
She closed her eyes and held her hands, palms down, over Dran's body. A silver stream of magic erupted from her palms and circled the draconic form, wrapping it in a bright sheet of light. Within seconds, the glow ceased. In the place of the majestic dragon lay the lifeless human form of Dran Dragor. Sindul beckoned for the 6 teammates to gather around her.
You teleported here, and that is how I will get you out.
She spread her arms out and snapped her fingers. Seconds later, they found themselves within the familiar resurrection chamber. The group felt a kind of relief at being back in the safety of the lower chambers of Temple Darkmoon. Before anyone could say anything to deviate her path, Sindul bolted to the large golden cross at the end of the room and knelt down before it. She mumbled a few prayers and the group watched in awe and discomfort the reanimation of the temple's high priest. When the deed was finished, Sindul whipped around and knelt at Dran's side, aesthetically verifying her work. The crew crowded around. An inquisitive expression crept onto Dran's features as he looked around at the group of warriors surrounding him. He looked up at Sindul and raised an eyebrow. Sindul rested a hand on his shoulder and smiled warmly.
They saw their mistake,
she said simply. Dran's jaw dropped, a gesture he would have preferred to omit, but he was too impressed to do otherwise.
How?
He fumbled, confused due to his sudden resurrection.
How can you be sure?
He asked skeptically. Elixia answered the priest's question.
I don't know if you noticed, but you're not dead anymore, that could be your first indication that we've seen our mistake.
She began on a derisive tone.
Secondly, well, we saw something through Sindel and the whole battle that we just couldn't help but hearken to. We were confused for a very long while, I must admit, and the more either side fought to clear things up for us, the worse things got.
The whole crew listened to Elixia now, finding clarity of thought in her words.
We realized that we were wrong, and we're sorry for it. It was a real shame that things had to get so bad in order for us to smarten up.
She finished on a sad note. There was silence for a while. Dran looked around at everyone in turn, trying to weigh their leader's conviction. Sindel watched him do so, herself convinced of her ex-team's sincerity. She had spent enough time with them to know that their words were true, even if they had never been on good terms with one another. Having satisfied himself with his staring, Dran got to his feet and brushed off his overcoat.
It's nice to see that you've all seen the light.
He frowned suddenly.
Now, I want you all to swear that you will never assault me or my temple ever again, and that you will stay away from the fight going on between Kelvin Blackstaff and I.
He remarked pointedly. 6 heads nodded in accordance with the high priest's words. The room felt awkward now. No one knew quite what to do, especially the 6 party members.
We can't go back to Kelvin, he'll have us killed for treachery. What happens now? We spend our lives as fugitives and leave the water deep?
Sanral asked emphatically, seeing nothing but darkness for his future. Beside him, Massage did not seem too affected. In truth, the wizard wanted by all costs to return to Menzoberranzan. He had not enjoyed his stay on the surface and desired to return home, but returning home would mean leaving Meeks, and Massage could not live with that. Dran shook his head.
No, I will not have you running about the streets like fools, even if you all deserve as much for your despicable deeds.
He began, then took a deep breath before saying his next words.
You have proven great worth, and I, having suffered the wrath of your skills, find no shame in declaring you all as a fine group of warriors. In light of this, I offer all 6 of you a permanent home here within Darkmoon as the temple's champions. It's the least you could do to repay the troubles you've caused.
He declared tentatively, hoping that he was not making a mistake due to a measure of greed. Sindel's hand tensed into a fist and then slackened as she realized that Darkmoon could actually use a set of fine combatants, especially if Kelvin would continue to pull tricks like the one he had with the raiding party.
I move to accept the invitation,
Prisma said after a while, stepping forth from the crew. She did not find any love lost in remaining within Waterdeep instead of returning to Chednasad. She figured her life would probably last longer if she remained on the surface anyway. Next to accept was Nightshade, who rested her hand on her friend's shoulder and smirked conservatively.
I also accept.
She piped, the life of a thief was best when properly employed, and besides, she had a lot more snooping to do around Darkmoon. Dran nodded thankfully at the 2 ladies, recognizing their worth.
Count me in.
Meeks cheered happily and bounded to Nightshade and Prisma's side. She grasped Elixia's arm as she went and pulled her along.
Me too.
Elixia said with a chuckle and pried Meek's hand from her arm. The 2 women looked expectantly over at Massage and Sanral. Dran and Sindel looked expectantly over at Massage and Sanral. The 2 drow wizards stood still. They did not like clergy, and teaming up with Sindel again, even if it wasn't really teaming up with her, did not sound like a good idea to them. It was their decision, they both knew, but there was so much tied to it. Meeks exhaled loudly and walked over to where Massage stood biting his lower lip.
Stay, silly mage, I don't want you to go away,
she said childishly and grasped Massage's sleeve tightly. Sanral and Elixia stared at each other and figured things out non-verbally. The connection between them was almost tangible. With a sigh of surrender, Massage wrapped an arm around Meek's waist.
Fine,
he said and pulled her to his side. Elixia smiled. Sanral mimicked her. The team had been one. The 2 walked over to each other and hugged tightly, burying their faces in each other's hair. Sindel and Dran shared a sigh of relief. A messenger tore into Kelvin's chambers later that night, his face racked with concern.
Sir,
he yelped, nearly tripping on the small table near the door to Kelvin's studying room. In his hand, the messenger held a parchment with some quick scribblings on it. Kelvin, who hated being disturbed during his reading, called rudely to the man.
What? What is it?
He barked. The messenger halted before the Archmage's high-backed chair and unrolled the parchment.
The spy you sent out to check on the reason for the lack of connection between you and your raiding party has some disturbing news,
he panted. Kelvin frowned deeply.
What kind of disturbing news?
He asked inquisitively. The messenger licked his lips nervously.
Your raiding party is no longer, well, yours, sir,
he said with a small smile of irony. Kelvin got to his feet and towered over the smaller man.
What are you saying?
He demanded, his tone growing more and more afflicted. The messenger backed away.
The group you sent out about a week ago. They've betrayed you, sir. They work for Darkmoon now.
He swallowed thickly. Kelvin's face contorted into an expression of utter disbelief.
What?
He screamed, and the messenger began to move towards the door.
Is there no one worthy of being trusted anymore? How could this have happened?
He went on, speaking to himself as much as to the messenger, who was partially gone by now. Kelvin clenched his fists.
When you want something done you have to do it yourself.
He rambled. The messenger shut the door soundlessly after him and left the fuming archmage to his own thoughts. The end. This was Darkmoon, by K.A. If you liked the story, please let the author know. This is a random audiobook appeared, signing off.